Good evening and welcome to Primetime Lawmakers for March 8th, 2011, the 26th legislative day of the 2011 session of the Georgia General Assembly. I'm Scott Slade. Coming up in tonight's program, after interruptions from angry students in the gallery and hours of impassioned debate, Governor Nathan Deal's Hope Bill passes the Senate. Changes will likely send the measure to conference committee. A controversial bill allowing billboard companies to clear-cut along state right-of-way passes the Senate. We continue our leadership interview series. Tonight, House Majority Caucus Vice Chairman Matt Ramsey talks judicial reform legislation. And it's a tough year for state government budgets. We'll go in-depth of the impact of budget cuts to human services with Senator Renee Unterman, chair of the Senate Health and Human Services Committee, and Alan Essig will join us. He's executive director of the Georgia Budget and Policy Institute. All that's coming up tonight on Primetime Lawmakers, but first, sweeping changes to the Hope Scholarship Program approved by the Georgia Senate. And Wandi Lawson's been following the debate, and she joins us live from the Capitol with all the details. Good evening, Wandi.
Hey, good evening, Scott. After nearly 4 hours of debate, the Senate approved HB 326, the governor's revision of the Hope Scholarship Program. Democrats and Republicans disagree about whether the requirements for the Zell Miller full tuition college scholarship shut out African Americans and students at rural high schools. Much of the debate today centered on whether the Lottery Corporation should provide a larger share of its profit to pre-K and Hope scholarships. Here's Senate Education Chair Jim Butterworth presenting the bill.
Production incentive payments, bonuses, or any other consideration paid to Lottery Corporation employees in addition to an employee's base compensation shall not exceed 25% of such employee's base compensation. In total, bonuses shall not exceed 1% of the net increase over the prior year's deposit into the Lottery for Education account. No bonuses may be awarded in years in which there is not a net increase over the prior year's deposit into the Lottery for Education account.
Senate Democrats wanted to modify the plan to allow current Hope recipients to maintain their scholarships. They wanted to extend full tuition scholarships to the top 3% of students at every Georgia high school and to increase the percentage of lottery revenue funding the scholarships.
This merely calls for a graduated increase each year. Fiscal year 2012, the net proceeds would equal at least 27.5%. In the fiscal year 2013, the net proceeds would equal 28.5%. Et cetera, until it gets to 30%. That's just the national average now. The original statute says as close as practicable to 35%. Now, the important part of this is the last sentence. Notwithstanding the provisions of this paragraph, in any fiscal year prior to fiscal year 2016, if the net proceeds in a given fiscal year are less than the net proceeds in the previous fiscal year. In other words, if we in fact do hamstring the lottery somehow, by requiring them to maximize the amount that's put into education, we'll stop. And we'll keep it at that level. So it is a circuit breaker that allows the lottery to step up, and if there is in fact a reduction, stop.
In 2010, about $257 million was spent in DeKalb County on lottery tickets. About $22 million was used for Hope scholarships for DeKalb County students. That means about 12% of the money spent in DeKalb County on lottery tickets came back to the county as Hope scholarships for its students. By contrast, as the senator from the 12th would tell you, Whitman County, almost $8 million was spent on lottery tickets. In 2010, only 10 Whitman County students went to college on the Hope Scholarship, costing roughly $35,000 or less than 0.5%.
Today's discussion was not limited to senators on the floor. Student protesters were removed from the balcony several times. Senators debated whether the proposal would educate the maximum number of students.
Based on the bill that came over from the House of Representatives, we would have one person go to college. One. Because last year's Macon County High School class only had one child that made 1,200 or better on the SAT. Stewart County spent $4 million on lottery tickets, 0 made 1,200 or better on the SAT. My home county is the largest county in my Senate district, Sumter County. In Sumter County, they spent $21 million in the year 2010 on lottery tickets. I have 4 students out of 258 seniors at America/Sumter County High School that have over a 3.7, and only one of those has made over 1,200 on the SAT.
In the end, the Senate rejected the Democrats' amendments but approved a revision of the Zell Miller Scholarship to offer that full tuition to the top 2 students at every high school in the state, and permitting high school students to substitute college courses for the advanced placement courses required in HB 326. The bill passed the Senate on a party line vote of 35 to 20. Changes made in the Senate will send that bill back to the House. Billboard owners scored a victory today with passage of HB 179 by the Senate. That measure allows businesses to clear-cut trees that block their signs, but much of today's debate was about whether the contents of those signs might be obscene.
The obscenity standard is something that the Supreme Court has let local communities decide, and if local communities decide to have strict standards, those strict standards can help replace these signs.
Senator Renee Unterman brought examples of roadside billboards in support of her amendment to fine the owners of obscene billboards.
Look, I'm not some right-wing radical. I am not trying to be out there and censor things, and I'm just trying to protect children. How can you argue with that?
Senator Joshua McCoon wanted to amend the bill so that it would only remain in effect if the General Assembly could determine its effectiveness.
Frankly, this issue of how billboards should fit into local communities ought to be decided by the local communities. We should not be placing a mandate that restricts the ability of local communities to handle these matters. And I believe that is what House Bill 179 does.
Senator Unterman was successful in amending the bill to include penalties of up to $10,000 for companies whose signs are deemed obscene. HB 179 cleared the Senate by a vote of 37 to 19. Changes made in the Senate means it returns to the House. And in the House today, they shot down a measure that would change the procedure for selecting a chairperson for the Public Service Commission. Bill sponsor Representative Don Parsons was questioned about why the House was considering HB 216.
Every commissioner who returned this year asked for it to be done. Every commissioner, every public service commissioner who returned this year asked for this bill to be introduced.
But isn't it true that the reason it was introduced was because there were a certain number of commissioners who didn't want to see other commissioners serve as the chair? Instead, they wanted to ensure that those voices never took charge?
No, sir. That is not, I don't know where you might have gotten that. That is not true at all.
Representative Carla Drenner begged to differ. She said HB 216 would further politicize the PSC.
This bill is a power play by 3 commissioners who want to control the agenda. Let me say this. The chair determines the rules on public comments, decides what and will not go into record, and appoints committee chairs, interveners who represent interest that those 3 commissioners don't agree with would have an even harder time getting their voices on the record.
HB 216 was defeated by a vote of 60 to 103. However, a measure providing technical students the opportunity to earn academic credit in high school was given approval by the House. House Speaker Pro Tem Jan Jones speaks in favor of HB 186.
For example, algebra. Instead of just taking algebra, which, some students would really rather die than have to take algebra, a student could take a technical school type course, a VOTEC course, and satisfy that material by learning it in a more applied fashion.
HB 186 passed the House by a vote of 164 to 4, sending it to the Senate. The House also approved a ban on synthetic methamphetamine, also known as bath salts. Representative Jay Neal read a description of the drug provided by the Louisiana Poison Control.
If you take the very worst of some of the other drugs, LSD and ecstasy with their hallucinogenic delusional type properties, PCP with extreme agitation, superhuman strength and combativeness, as well as the stimulant properties of cocaine and meth, if you take all the worst of those and put them together, this is what you get. It's ugly. He's talking about bath salts, synthetic cocaine, synthetic methamphetamine. And no, this isn't the bath salt that you buy at Bed Bath & More or any of those places. This is a product that is designed specifically for one purpose, and that's to be a designer drug.
Although Representative Neal acknowledges use of bath salts is not widespread in Georgia, he says this legislation can cut the supply off before it becomes a problem. HB 199 passed the House 150-9, and it now moves to the Senate. Reporting live from the Capitol, I'm Nwandi Lawson for Primetime Lawmakers.
Thanks very much, Nwandi. Have a good evening.
You too, Scott.
Now on to tonight's leadership interview segment. Nwandi sat down this afternoon with House Majority Caucus Vice Chairman Matt Ramsey to talk law and order, beginning with the reasons the state is considering an overhaul to the criminal justice system.
I think as time has gone by, when in the 1990s there was a big rush to enact 3 strikes you're out, mandatory minimums in the area of particularly in drug offenses. And over time, I think that bill is now kind of coming home to roost, so to speak. Over the last 2 decades, we've seen our prisons become more and more filled with those that have committed nonviolent offenses. And I think it makes sense for us to take a look. Are there other means by which certainly we need to deal with narcotics activities in our communities? It's a serious problem. But what is the most effective way for us to do with it? Is it locking them up and taking resources away from conducting other community safety, criminal jurisprudence activities? I think it's clearly an issue that needs study. We've been putting it off far too long, and I appreciate the governor's leadership and the speaker's leadership on taking the issue on, so we can take a comprehensive look at every dollar that's being spent in our criminal justice system. When you're talking about $1 billion a year out of a $17 billion state budget, that's a big amount of money we're spending each year.
You had the successful passage of HB 87 over on the House side. Those who oppose that immigration reform, of course, say that they haven't had adequate input into the bill. Can you talk a little bit about kind of how the public was able to have input and how that might have influenced the legislation?
There was a concern expressed. We have provisions in there that will give citizens the ability to seek injunctive relief against governments that don't enforce a couple of provisions that have been the law of the state for 5 years. What we are sensitive to, though, is that doesn't result in a proliferation of frivolous lawsuits, given the budget climate out there for the state and local governments. So what we've done is we've worked with local governments and state agencies to make sure they're given a notice opportunity and an opportunity to cure violations before that litigation goes forward. That's an example of a change we made through the committee process. We've had some suggestions from the Attorney General's office in terms of shoring up the constitutionality of the bill. We've made those changes along with many other legal minds on the committee and just interested parties in the bill. So again, I think looking at all 22 pages of the bill that's been through a couple dozen revisions, I think we just have a much sounder product now than when we started.
And you know, of course, the critics also say that we're setting ourselves up for some Arizona-style lawsuits, and I'm wondering, what about this bill do you think kind of protects Georgia from a similar situation?
Well, I don't think there's anything we can do that's going to prevent fringe groups like the ACLU from bringing a lawsuit on purely philosophical grounds. I think our bill is, if you sit down and read HB 87 and you sit down and read the Arizona bill, they're two very different bills. I think ours is a much better bill, in fact, more comprehensive and more directly gets at the issues that Georgia is facing, kind of the unique set of problems being created by illegal immigration in Georgia. So I think we've got a better bill. I think the notion of we shouldn't pass legislation because we're fearful of some fringe group suing us, we'd never get anything done if that was the case. And we're going to do what we think is best for Georgia and pass a bill that we believe to be constitutional.
You also are sponsoring HB 59. Can you talk about how that legislation works and how that might impact students here in Georgia?
In my opinion, if there is one qualified legal U.S. citizen that's not sitting in a college classroom in Georgia and a legal alien has that spot, it's one too many. Beyond that, it's just a question to me that I just can't wrap my mind around why we are dedicating resources to providing a college education to those that under federal law are ineligible to work. It's against federal law. You cannot employ an individual that is in the country illegally. So what are we providing a college education for? It's ultimately so they can become productive members of society and get a job. And we're spending time and money in Georgia educating those that are in the country illegally, which to me is a bad use of resources.
And you also are sponsoring HB 47, which would alter some of the insurance products that are available here in Georgia. Describe that legislation and how it might impact consumers here.
HB 47 is our effort as state policymakers to provide our citizens with access to a greater range of insurance products, both from a price and a coverages standpoint. Right now, in the individual market in Georgia, which insures about 5% of our marketplace, but it's a critical segment of our marketplace because that's where the 20% that are uninsured, that's the only place they can go to get insurance. And right now they're choosing not to because we have a situation where you can only get a one-size-fits-all policy. What we're going to do is give insurance companies the ability to sell products, Georgia insurance companies sell products they sell in other states here, which will expand the universe of available policy options by 50 potentially. I think it's a great opportunity to give our uninsured an opportunity to get more, to get better access to insurance and find something that meets their family's needs.
Now, of course, in committee, you've heard from opponents like ARP. They're concerned that now these companies will come in and they won't meet Georgia's standards. People will be without care for certain aspects of their health. How do you respond to those?
Well, first I would say this. Every consumer protection that's available right now, access to Georgia courts, access to the Georgia Insurance Commissioner, problem grievance process is going to be maintained. This is Georgia companies. There is no doubt we're going to give consumers the ability to buy products, insurance products, that potentially have more coverages than what you have in Georgia right now or less coverages. We think the more you can put the power of the free market to work on behalf of a consumer, it's going to be a good thing.
Representative Matt Ramsey is the vice chair of the Republican Caucus in the House. We want to thank you so much for joining us here on Primetime Lawmakers.
My pleasure. Thank you.
And thanks to you both. Before we go any further, I want to explain why I'm wearing the yellow rose this evening. It's in support of the women members of the Georgia legislature. You saw a lot of those yellow roses around the state capitol today. In late 1920, the 19th Amendment to the United States Constitution was ratified finally, and women in this country were finally given the right to vote. As this amendment was being ratified, state legislators across the country wore a yellow rose to demonstrate their support of the suffrage movement. I have daughters and granddaughters, and that's why I'm wearing it. You go, girls. After this short break, we'll be talking state services and how budget cuts could affect you. We'll be joined by Alan Essig with the Georgia Budget Policy Institute with a little breaking news about revenue coming into the state coffers as well. Stay with us. Welcome back to Primetime Lawmakers. Millions of Georgians rely on services from the state for help in their daily lives. From small children to senior citizens, the state provides assistance to those who can't provide for themselves through agencies such as the Department of Human Services, its subsidiary, the Department of Family and Children's Services, and the Department of Labor. And the purpose of our discussion this evening is to take a closer look at what state service will look like during tough economic times. In essence, how budget decisions directly affect you, your parents, and your children. And Alan Essig has been nice enough to join us this evening. He's the Executive Director of the Georgia Budget Policy Institute. Great to have you back on Primetime Lawmakers.
Great to be here.
And, you know, we talked last week about the deficit being in the framework, a structural deficit. Are we beginning to feel that in human services areas like DFACS, elderly services, mental health?
We've been feeling that for the last 3 years. We've cut across the board in human services. They face budget cuts of 15, 20, 25% in various programs. With the elderly, children, Department of Labor, it's job training, and that especially as the bad economy we're in, where more and more Georgia citizens are trying to get services because of their economic situation, it becomes tougher and tougher.
And the population's gone up in Georgia, for goodness sake, over the past 3 years. Well, we had another million people, maybe? Well, we have more customers for these services.
No, and most of the more customers is because of the tough economic times. And an example of some of the difficulty of the budget cuts is we've cut funding for eligibility workers. And those are the workers in Department of Human Services who help folks who, go through the paperwork of being eligible for things like food stamps. So as more and more people are applying for food stamps, there's fewer and fewer staff to help them. And especially in this recession, there are so many people who are applying for state services who've never dealt with the state before. There's a lot of traditionally middle-class folks who've lost their job, who've never had to deal with the state bureaucracy, and having the cuts in staff has made it more difficult to get them the services they need.
As far as the impact of the money that goes into the system, particularly, we hear of things like, and I want to ask you about policy because you just look at the numbers. For instance, DFACS, they've got a new director now, Department of Family and Children's Services. She's had her hands full with cleaning up a few areas and even doing some high-profile investigations into foster children who died in foster care. Is that a direct result of lack of funding, lack of personnel, lack of supervision?
Well, I mean, I don't know if it's a direct result, but I think the budget cuts have made their jobs that much harder. I don't envy DFACS workers. I don't envy the director of DFACS. It's an incredibly difficult job under the best of circumstances. With the lack of resources they've had in the last 3 years and the budget cuts, it just makes it that much harder to protect the health and safety of the children.
Yeah, and we're talking about some of the most frail people in our society, from young children without parents to the elderly, the mentally impaired, that sort of thing.
It's the most vulnerable, and that's the shame of the situation. They are the ones who are being affected. And again, it's not, I mean, I think the General Assembly and the governor, whether it's Governor Perdue or Governor Deal, have tried to protect it as much as possible, but it becomes a math problem. As revenues have collapsed and we're cutting budgets across the board, the budgets of the human services are affected. And especially in this economic time when there's more and more need for the services, it has the cuts have a larger impact.
A lot of people like to rail, about food stamp, limousine food stamp recipients, that sort of thing. I don't know if that happens very much. How much money are we talking about as far as a percentage of the state budget is concerned for these services?
Well, the entire budget for the Department of Human Services is less than 3% of the state budget, which means that a $50 million budget cut in the Department of Education it has an impact, but not a huge impact. You cut the Department of Human Services budget by $50 million, and they've been cut a lot more than that. It has a very significant impact on the services that they have to deliver.
So 3% of roughly $17 billion, we're looking at around $500 million.
$500 million, and that's the scope of the fiscal problem we have in the state. When you're talking about multi-billion-dollar deficits, you can eliminate the entire Department of Human Services and just begin to deal with the problem. And obviously we're not going to do that, and there's no intention of doing that, but when you're cutting them 20, 25%, when they've lost 50, 75, $100 million, that has a serious impact on the services they deliver.
Priorities. How are priorities set when you talk about these line items in the budget? Is it just like the lifeboat philosophy, women and children first? Who gets help first?
Well, I mean, again, I think the governor or General Assembly have tried to prioritize the health and safety as much as they can. I think the appropriations committees, the standing committees have, senators and reps take their job very seriously and care deeply about human services. But again, it becomes a math problem. Without additional revenues, if we're going to depend just on budget cuts to balance the budget, it becomes extremely difficult to protect these programs and these services as much as we'd like to.
Now, you mentioned a moment ago that Governor Perdue and others have done what they can to preserve these services. They've gone looking for funding in other places, and one of the places they've gone is the federal government. Is that dangerous in this current deficit hawk environment?
Well, what we've done to try to protect and try to not to cut services as much as possible while still saving state funds is we moved a lot of funding that's been traditionally state funding, some child protective services, child welfare, mental health, to federal lines. And the danger in that is as we start cutting the federal budget over the next couple of years, those programs become very vulnerable from from federal budget cuts, which again, in those programs were traditionally state funded, and now they'll be affected by possible future federal budget cuts, which seem to be inevitable. That's coming down.
And right now, there's not a pool of state money to take that federal money's place, right?
Right. I mean, if by moving over to federal line, if the federal budget ends up getting cut, we don't have a lot of options to protect the programs further.
And the supplemental budget that's just been passed and almost miraculously approved without a conference committee, and the big budget that's coming up for 2012, what kind of treatment is Human Services getting in those? Do we depend on the federal government in those budgets?
There's more a movement to move state funds over to federal. There are additional cuts in Human Services in both budgets. Again, it's a balancing approach, and I think as long as we're depending on 100% budget cuts to solve our fiscal problems, if we're not going to do a balanced approach, if we're not going to look at additional revenues, it's inevitable that these programs get cut. The hope is that the cuts do as least damage as possible, but the cuts have done damage in the past, and they'll continue to do damage in the future. One
of the great things the Georgia Budget Policy Institute does is you move beyond just the numbers, and you really get down to the street level for impact. For our viewers, maybe give us at least a few seconds here on just what this might mean to a Georgia family in need. Are they just suddenly everything dries up?
Well, it's not a question of everything drying up. For instance, again, if you lose your job and you are depending on unemployment insurance and you need some help with food to feed your family, the food stamp program is available. If we cut eligibility workers, it becomes that much more difficult to get the services you need when you need them. It kind of overwhelms the system. One thing about bad economic times is things like child abuse goes up, elderly abuse goes up, the stress of the economy, and as DFACS and Child Protective Services is facing budget cuts, they get overwhelmed. So it's not a question of suddenly the lights go out. It's the cumulative effect of more pressure on the system, which has negative results for what we're trying to do. 4 legislative days left at crossover day, and what the new budget, the big budget, has to be on the table and passed by the House, right? By next week. I think it's coming out of the House Appropriations Committee on Thursday, and I think the plan is for the House to pass it on Friday.
While we've got you here, different subject. We were talking about the deficit a moment ago, and U.S. Senator Saxby Chambliss has even been behind closed doors, meeting with Senate colleagues, part of the Gang of Six, and others, trying to find a way to make some real dents in the federal deficit. What are you hearing about that, and is he really sticking his neck out here?
Yeah, I give Senator Chambliss credit. He's taking some big political risks. Him and Senator Warner and several other senators are trying to, on a bipartisan basis, come to some solutions to the federal budget crisis. And Senator Warner is talking to his base about potential cuts in social programs and entitlement programs, and upsetting his base somewhat. And I think Senator Chambliss, and correctly so, is talking about the potential of additional revenues we need, and he takes a gamble with his base. But that's to solve whether it's on the state level or the federal level. The politics of this is Democrats and Republicans have to hold hands and jump off the cliff together. If the expectation is only one party is going to take responsibility for making the tough decisions, it becomes extremely hard to make those decisions.
And additional revenue means potentially the taxpayer has to put something else in the pot.
Yeah, I think what Senator Chambliss is stressing is the tax expenditures in the budget. So I think he would argue it's not a tax increase. It's it's lessening some expenditures, some special tax breaks. And on the federal level, we're talking billions and trillions of dollars, not the millions on the state level. And I think he's talking, if we get a handle on some of that, it could help balance the budget in the long term.
Thanks for helping us keep an eye on this.
My pleasure.
It's great to see you again.
Thank you.
All right, Alan Essig with us this evening. Primetime Lawmakers will not be seen tomorrow because the Georgia General Assembly is not in session. But be sure to tune in for the Georgia Tech Adventure Prize, where students will compete to see who has the best inventions. The Adventure Prize, live at GPB at 7 tomorrow. Primetime Lawmakers will return Thursday, March 10th at 7 p.m. If you'd like to see a repeat of this broadcast, you can catch it tomorrow morning at 5:30 on GPB. Coming up next, Susie Orman's Money Class. Stay tuned for an evening of great programming right here on GPB. And that's our broadcast for this 26th legislative day of the 2011 session. Thanks to our guest for joining us tonight, for Nwandi Lawson and the whole Primetime Lawmakers team. I'm Scott Slade. We'll see you Thursday. Have a good night.
This is a GPB original production.